sad, but brave of you to get through that. It is my pleasure to, I'm Garrett, by the way. Most of you know me. I'm the Director of Undergrad Studies here in philosophy. If you don't know me, you should come by, say hi sometime. It is my great pleasure to introduce Peter St. Andre. I'll tell you a few things about him here, which I printed out. He's an old classmate, Professor Lees, who you know, of course, at Columbia University. He decided against pursuing a PhD in philosophy. Not everyone makes wise career choices, but it's embarrassing. But yeah, he pursued a career in technology. He's worked both for startups and for large companies like IBM and Cisco. I've heard of those, right? And he's now a principal engineer at Mozilla. And he's authoring a technical book. He's authored over 100 industry standards for the internet. And he's published 7 short books on philosophical themes, which I know he has somewhere.
I've got some samples here somewhere.
Use his props, so it's legit. I can vouch for it. It's right over there. He's currently translating Epicurus, writing an epitome of Aristotle's ethics, and researching the ancient skeptic philosopher Pyrrho. So, if you have like one free hand, maybe from the people, we can welcome our speaker, Peter.
All right. So, thank you, Garrett. Appreciate it. You're majoring in what? Right? So this is the response you get. I know my parents said, "What? What are you majoring in? This is ridiculous." I'm here to tell you that philosophy is a great foundation for success. And I know lots of people who've been successful majoring in philosophy, and we're going to find out why. Thanks for coming out on this snowy evening. Appreciate your attention. I'll tell you a little bit about me, supplementing what Garrett told you. I studied philosophy at Columbia. I was so shy at the time, I don't think I ever met Professor Lee. So we met for the first time today. I was a NEH Younger Scholar program they had. I studied with Gisela Stryker. I did a thing during the summer and did some paper that no one ever read. But I decided against an academic career, in part because I was sort of burnt out. I took like all these graduate school classes, and I was taking 5 graduate school classes a semester, and people thought I was nuts, which I was. So then I bounced around for a while, and I've worked on the internet since 1996. So I'm one of the people who kind of defines how the internet works for some of the things that I am a specialist in. Some of those are open source software. So there's technology that, like Apple, that you can't actually look at the source code. Why I'm using this computer, don't ask me. And then there's things like Linux and Apache and projects like that, where anyone can read the source code, anyone can contribute to the source code. So I got involved in these open source communities back really when I started. And I got involved in a certain community and started giving little talks to maybe 5 people because I was super shy. And eventually I've given talks to 2,000 people. So that's been fun. So I know a lot about instant messaging, how, texting, things like that. I know all about that. Audio video conferencing, how do things like Google Hangouts work? All of those things. I know a lot about video transcoding and audio stuff. It's magic. Internationalization. So how do we show computers in different languages? How do you, right to left languages like Hebrew or Arabic and things like that? I know a whole bunch about internationalization. I kind of wish I didn't, but learn about that. But I know a lot about internationalization. Information security. How do you keep people from stealing your information that's on your computers that travel around the internet? Also online privacy. To me, very important. I have a lot of knowledge about that and concerns about how some of these technologies work. You need people who understand the technologies in order to fight back against people who just want to be able to see everything that you do. So I've worked on this, and I know a lot about a lot of these aspects of how the internet works. I've done a lot of different things in my career. So I started out doing writing and editing, because that's basically all I knew how to do as a philosophy major. So I did that kind of thing for a while. I did what's called instructional design, so putting together training programs. I had an older gentleman who I knew moved to Atlanta and worked on a training program that we had. It's kind of time management, really. I moved back to New York and worked on at a company that did sales training. Sounds very exciting, I know, but lots of people pay lots of money to get sales training for their salespeople so that they can make more money. It's all about money, by the way. That's basically my talk. I did instructional design. I got in trouble with the IRS. I didn't pay my taxes for a few years because I was a stupid philosophy major. I didn't know anything about the real world. So then I had to work 2 jobs for a while. So I was working at night and on the weekends. I did customer service, lots of fun. You learn about irate customers. You learn about taking orders. This was before the internet, really. So people would call in and place orders and stuff like this. I worked at the body shop for a while and things like this. So I did customer service. Good experience. I got fired from one of my jobs that I had. And so, but the internet was becoming a hot thing. I know you guys have all lived with the internet since day one, but back in the day, old people like us, there was no internet, and so the internet was sort of becoming a hot thing. And there was a company that, when I got fired, I was like, I really want to work on this internet stuff. And so I found a job that we were repurposing printed materials for the internet. And so I went to work for that company. I started learning computer programming there. I did something called systems analysis. So we would try to figure out how to architect the system, how to design the system so that it would do what it needed to do. And you would talk to the customers and figure out what features they wanted. It's kind of related to software architecture, is sort of a higher level of that. How do you actually design how the systems work, different aspects of the computing devices. I did a lot of technical writing. Writing is something that you can learn to do pretty well as a philosophy major because you have to write a lot of papers. Once you understand the technical aspects of how things work, you can put the technology knowledge together with the writing, and you can do tech writing. It's not really the most fulfilling career for some people, but I've done a lot of technical writing. Developer evangelism. So once I got over my extreme shyness that I had, I would go out and give talks. So I ran a developer community. Developers are not land developers, these are programmers. So I got involved with technology called Jabber, which was instant messaging. Our little company got bought by Cisco eventually. I would go out and give talks. I would go talk at conferences, and maybe it was a nice small group like this, hundreds of people maybe, and we would put together training about how this technology worked. And so I would do a lot of that, work with developers, help them figure out how to use the technologies that we had defined. We call that developer evangelism, which is kind of a funny name. I've done a lot of public speaking. As you might be able to tell, I'm pretty comfortable with it now. I was deathly afraid. Actually, I was telling Professor Lee and Garrett that the one fear that people have that's stronger than the fear of death is the fear of public speaking. Because you're not, at least if you die, you're just dead, right? But public speaking, you're going to embarrass yourself. You have to live with this forever, right? So people are more afraid of public speaking than they are. I was a super introvert in college. You wouldn't tell now, but I just fake it. The world is run by extroverts, by the way. So if you're an introvert, it's hard. Industry standardization. So like Garrett was saying, I've written a lot of documentation basically that defines how things like messaging work, aspects of security for the internet, privacy for the internet. And people then read these specifications that get developed in these big committees essentially, and then the programmers go out and write the things that go along with the standard. So I've done a lot of that. I've written thousands of pages of these things. And I got to travel all over the world. So I went to Taipei and Beijing and Japan and all over Europe going to all these meetings. And you meet the same old people in just different hotels. It's not that exciting. I've done a lot of mentoring. So as I've gotten farther along in my career, I help people who are more junior figure out how to navigate, how to plan their careers essentially and get ahead in the world. I've done management. So I've had teams of people working for me, which is a fun experience. I've even done sales. Because I never thought in my wildest imaginings that I would ever have to do sales. But a couple of years ago, I was working for a company where I was the CTO, which is Chief Technology Officer, and we lost our biggest customer. And what do you have to do then? Well, either you fire everyone or you got to get business in the door. So I was doing sales, which is hard. So now I'm a principal engineer at Mozilla. I work on Firefox, the Firefox web browser. It's an open source, non-profit browser for the internet. Principal engineer is kind of, we only have a few of them, so we have 1,100 people in Mozilla, and I think we have about half a dozen principal engineers. So it's a very advanced role. I work for the CTO of Firefox. We work on hard problems. Basically, I do consulting on hard problems. That could be internal problems, could be technical problems, could be organizational issues that we're trying to solve, and I also work with customers, partners, things like that. So I wanted to introduce silly cartoons because every presentation needs to have a silly cartoon. This one says, "He's not a hunter or a gatherer, Daddy. He's a consultant." Right? So what do consultants do? No one knows, right? But they get paid a lot. I get paid very well, by the way. I'm not bragging because I'm not a money-oriented person, but you get farther in your career and they keep showering money at you. So that's the business side of me. I also, on the side, write philosophy books because I like philosophy. Who doesn't like philosophy, right? So I wrote a little dictionary of philosophy. These are all tiny little books, right? If you know the quote from Pascal, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. It's hard to write short books. So I have the dictionary of philosophy. I have a confession. I was a big Ayn Rand fan when I was a teenager. Okay, so I can help you with this. Okay, so I wrote I also like poetry, so I wrote some poems. This has a bunch of translations from Horace, who was a Latin poet who was very influenced by Epicurus. I don't have a copy of that one. I must not have had any at home. Then I've got my little Rand book, because I had to get this Rand stuff out of my head. So I wrote a book on Ayn Rand. That one's sort of they're all in different genres. Then I wrote I have extra copies of these if you're curious, by the way. I wrote a book on Epicurus, ancient Greek philosopher. That's in the form of a dialogue, but an email dialogue. So people write these emails back and forth. Let's see, then after that, I'm still writing these books just for fun. This one's on Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. Actually, his name was pronounced Thoreau, but Henry David Thoreau. So I wrote a book on him. Some people have read Walden. I read all of his journals. He has about 8,000 pages in his journal, so I basically read all that and kind of distilled it down. And then I wrote just earlier this year, I published this poems on Nietzsche, which is kind of a weird project, but he was a poet too. A lot of people don't know, but he wrote poetry, and his thought is kind of poetic. So that's fun stuff. As mentioned, I'm also working on some other things. So when I did the Epicurus project, I started to translate his stuff from Greek. So I'm working to finish those translations. I'm a big Aristotle fan. Aristotle is like the guy, right? So I'm writing a short book on Aristotle. I'm actually doing a lot of research on that right now. His views on happiness, or eudaimonia. And I have this crazy idea to write a novel about Alexander the Great and Pyrrho. So Alexander the Great, of course, they say he was, explorer. Basically, we went around killing people and conquering all these different parts of the world, and he was trying to kind of unite these different cultures. Pyrrho was one of the original skeptical philosophers, and so this was ancient Greece, of course, they had philosophers everywhere. They were just teeming with philosophers. And several philosophers went with Alexander the Great all over. So they went to Persia, they ended up in India eventually. And Pyrrho supposedly was influenced by these Buddhist or some sort of, they called them the gymnosophists, the naked philosophers. And they were these people that I don't know how they translated between the languages and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, Pyrrho went with Alexander the Great. And no one really knows how Alexander the Great died. So I'm thinking, philosophical murder mystery with Pyrrho and Alexander the Great, bestseller. Who knows? Probably not. No one reads my books. I sell about one book a week. If you want to make money, don't write books. Let me tell you, it doesn't work. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about you. I don't like to talk about myself really. So here's my thesis. In true Hegelian style, we have our thesis, and I won't have the antithesis or the synthesis, but I'll have my thesis. Is that you can achieve success as a philosophy major. Lots of people have done this. Harrison Ford was a philosophy major. He's kind of well known. Steve Martin was a philosophy major. Pretty well known comedian and banjo player, by the way. So he's multi-talented. George Soros is probably one of the wealthiest people in the world. Very well known as an investor. He was a philosophy major. Carly Fiorina, who was CEO of HP for a number of years, she, I think, majored in medieval philosophy and history. Reid Hoffman, I'll talk a little bit more about him. He founded this company called LinkedIn. Some of you might be on LinkedIn. Reid, I don't know him personally, I'm going to call him Reid. He is worth $3 billion or something like that. He's also an investor, so he made all this money with LinkedIn, and now he invests in other companies. I'll tell you a little bit more about some of his philosophy of investing later on. Some Supreme Court justices, David Souter, or Souter, I never know how to pronounce his name, Stephen Breyer, were both philosophy majors. And so on. By the way, if you start looking on the internet, famous philosophy majors, you get all sorts of misinformation. Bill Clinton was not a philosophy major. I hate to break it to you. The other person who was not a philosophy major, John Elway. He was an economics major. But sometimes you'll see these websites, oh, all these famous people studied philosophy, right? Not all of them did. You got to check your facts. So why have these people been successful? First, I don't want to, stroke your egos too much, but philosophy majors tend to be pretty smart. They tend to do very well on standardized tests. I was going to look this up, but I ran out of time. There's some citations on this. I do have footnotes. You won't be able to read them. I'll post these on my website, and then I can send it around to Professor Lee, and she can pass it on if she wants. Because I'm an open source guy, so I just throw everything out there. All my books are in the public domain, by the way, so I don't even do copyright. In any case, intelligence is highly correlated with career success. So if we read Schmidt, Schaffer, and O in Personnel Psychology from 2008, basically smart people get ahead because they can figure out how to work the system and they have better skills and so on. Life is not easy if you're not as smart. Philosophy majors tend to be pretty smart. We also learn some key skills as philosophy majors. There's a lot of thinking that we do. Well, we have to think critically, logically, creatively, systematically, analyze hard problems. Philosophy problems are really hard, and you have to do a lot of thinking to try to figure them out. And then if you have solutions to those problems, well, of course, everyone's going to question your solutions. If Aristotle didn't solve it, who do you think you are, right? So you got to try to sort of defend your solution to these problems. That's not easy as well. There's a lot of information that you have to sort of synthesize because there have been so many views on certain topics throughout 2,000 plus years of history. Writing. You have to write clearly because otherwise you can't get your point across. You have to be persuasive about what you're saying. You also have to listen well because philosophy is not just you sitting in a room, but it's interaction in trying to convince people. Everyone has different viewpoints. So, oh, well, I think you're wrong. Well, I think you're wrong. Well, Hegel said this. Well, Kant said that. So you have to understand what these different viewpoints are. And of course, that's just the German tradition. Then if you go into the Anglo-American tradition and phenomenology and so on, there's a lot of disagreement. How do you understand those different viewpoints? Handling ambiguity. There's a lot. What's more ambiguous than philosophy, right? It's so hard to figure out what the right answers are. Maybe we never will, but there's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of ambiguity in the world, so it's a good thing to figure out how to handle that. Dealing with paradox, or what the Greeks called aporia, there's a lot of paradoxical things. This is Socrates, Aristotle, people like that said philosophy begins in wonder. If we're dealing with these paradoxes, how do we overcome them? How do we figure out what the solutions are? These are things that, and there's more of them, and now these are very high order skills. They're extremely valuable in the workplace, although it might not seem that way when you start out. Few people can really do these things well. There's a lot of subtlety involved. You don't necessarily get that kind of subtle thinking if you studied poli-sci or if you studied economics or something like that. They are becoming more important because a lot of routine things are becoming automatized. Well, what does that leave for us humans? I don't want to think too much about what the future is going to be like there, but a lot of the routine things are becoming automatized. What happens is that the tasks that are left are more difficult and require more subtlety. The other thing that I found is that the sort of philosophical insights and skills that we have as philosophy majors, they start to stand out later in your career. Because as you get higher in organizations and farther along in your career, you have more and more ambiguity. You have more and more paradox. There's a lot that's unclear. How do you work through that? Well, if you have some of that background in philosophy, you're better able to do that than people who are sort of doing more tightly scoped sorts of problem solving earlier in life. So by mid-career, philosophy majors actually do quite well financially. Not that I'm all about money, because I'm really not, but it's nice to get paid, right? So by mid-career, philosophy majors tend to be pretty high earners. There's a link to this from the philosophy department website. This is especially true at the high end. So there's percentiles, right? So the 10 percentile is the folks who are making the least. The 90th percentile is the people who are making the most. I would study this little Wall Street Journal link, which is also, I believe, on the philosophy department website. Philosophy majors at the 90th percentile actually do better than electrical engineering majors. So your parents might have said, well, you should become an electrical engineering major. I think my parents did. And I'm like, ha, 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 here I am. I'm making more than the EE people, right? So it's not a bad thing to be a philosophy major. And you can make the argument to your parents, or whoever, your friends, like, why are you majoring in philosophy? Well, actually, there's a lot of upside. Now, the interesting thing about these numbers, going back to this survey, is that the philosophy majors are also, a lot of them don't make very much money at all. So the range in philosophy majors is wider than EE majors, let's say. So your electrical engineering majors, maybe the least well-paid electrical engineering major is maybe making $60,000 a year, let's say. Your least well-paid philosophy major is probably making $20,000 a year, still serving coffee at Starbucks or something like that. So depends on what you do with it, right? But your upside potential is pretty high as a philosophy major. But, and it's a big but, philosophy, there's no guarantee of success. There's never a guarantee of success, right? But there's some challenges with being a philosophy major, in my experience, my very difficult personal experience. It can hamper you in several ways that can be challenging to overcome. The one thing I found was I needed to adjust my attitude. Now, I was a philosophy major. I was kind of, in the cloistered university, and I thought I was going to get a PhD and all that kind of stuff. I decided not to do that. I didn't know bupkis, which is a technical word for Polish, about the real world, which is difficult. And I kind of had a chip on my shoulder because I was an arrogant Ayn Rand fan at the time. So I thought, well, I got big ideas. That's all that matters. It's not good to be just a big idea person. In my industry, technology, we talk about people who are starters and people who are finishers. And starter sounds great, right? Starting things off. Well, not so much. The attitude we have in my industry is, well, starters are big idea people. They dream up the stuff to do, but the finishers get things done. You want finishers on your team. You want to be a finisher. People who get things done are recognized in your organization. People who get things done are respected. People who get things done are rewarded, financially rewarded in terms of their position in the organization. People who are big idea people, they kind of get shunted aside. Oh, they're in the strategy or department or something like that. We don't really listen to those people. We got to have them on the team, but they're not really very well respected necessarily, and they don't go as far in organizations. So you need to learn how to be a finisher, which in my experience was not easy. It was in fact very difficult because I like big ideas. I just like to think about big ideas. That's why I was a philosophy major, right? Well, it took a lot of discipline to knuckle under and actually figure out how to be a finisher, how to get things done. You have to continually learn things. Now, learning is fun, right? We all were in school. We like to learn. I love to keep reading philosophy. But some of these things are pretty darn boring. Let's say things like proofreading or maintaining lab equipment. One of my early jobs, I worked at IBM Research in the summers, and maintaining lab equipment is not all that exciting, folks. I got to tell you. And these are, I knew people who have done even worse things, but things like this are kind of boring, right? But they're, analyzing spreadsheets or balance sheets for corporations or stuff like that. Not that exciting, but you might have to learn them. Some of them, if you're of a more left persuasion, might seem hopelessly bourgeois, right? Time management, punctuality, showing up on time, being polite. I mean, it's like Ben Franklin garbage or something like that, right? Are these really my values? Well, if you want to be a finisher and want to get things done and have an impact in the world, you kind of got to learn these things. I was sort of a hoity-toity philosophy major, so I said, well, these things are kind of beneath me. Customer service, I got to answer the telephone and talk to like real people and solve problems for them. Gosh, I didn't go to get a philosophy major for that. Hey, actually, customer service was a great experience. Some of them might be unpleasant. For instance, negotiating. Who really loves to haggle and negotiate? I've had to ask for raises before. I'm not a money-oriented person. I don't really want to negotiate with people, but it's kind of a good skill to have. Some of them might be positively frightening, like public speaking. I hated public speaking when I started. What a horrible thing to have to do. But if you get out there and you talk at conferences and stuff like that, you get to be pretty well known. And then if you got fired, like I've done several times, it's pretty easy to find a job because people know who you are, because you've been out talking. Some of these might even seem vaguely unethical, and we're philosophy majors, like navigating office politics. There's politics. I just figured this out last year when I got basically, told to leave a company, is that you got to figure out politics. You got to figure out how to deal with people. It's not exactly a lot of fun. It might even seem sort of vaguely unethical. Power, I got to figure out who's in power and who's not and sort of deal with those people, but this is something you have to do, especially if you want to have an impact in the world. You have to learn how to work in organizations. I found that motivating myself to learn these things was not easy because I didn't want to learn a lot of these things, but it stood me in good stead to figure out how to apply myself in these areas. So that's sort of the attitude side of it, the motivational side of it. The other side of it is practical skills. And I will be talking about practical skills from the attitudinal side or the motivational side, but what are these things that you need to learn? Well, no one's going to hire you if you know about the categorical imperative or Aristotle's practical syllogism or stuff like that. That's not what you get paid to do. As I have found, the benefits of philosophical thinking and philosophical training really kick in later in your career because as the problems get to be more subtle. But you got to start somewhere, right? So if you want to climb the career ladder in any sort of way, you got to get on the bottom rung, which is not easy. I found was difficult. You need practical skills to get hired, and there's a few ways to do that. One approach is you start in all these low-level jobs, you bounce around a lot, you make lots of mistakes, which I've made lots of mistakes in my time. You teach yourself, you try to learn things on the side, and then you don't really start your career for 5 or 10 years. This is what I did. I would say it's not the recommended approach. You can do it. It's not necessarily a lot of fun. And you also, where you get in your career typically depends a lot on how you start. So if you start at a low level, a lot of times you sort of can't get as far as you want to get because you've been spinning your wheels for 5 or 10 years, which is what I did. A better approach, I think, is to double major. Or major in minor or whatever, minor in philosophy, major in something else. I double majored, but I did philosophy and ancient Greek. Okay, so I kind of missed out on the practical element. I love Greek. Don't get me wrong, Greek is really cool, and I love the Greek philosophers and Greek literature and stuff like that. But it didn't really get me going in the career world to double major in philosophy and ancient Greek. Smarter people that I know have done philosophy and computer science, engineering, math, statistics, biology, psychology is a good one, graphic design. I know someone who did graphic design and philosophy, economics, business, finance, even accounting. I have a friend who did philosophy and accounting, which you got to think those are like the two opposite poles. Accounting's got to be so boring and so rote and all this kind of stuff. He's now an investment advisor, because he sort of figures out how the world works and how people can navigate that and invest their money. So these combinations open up a lot of possibilities. A lot of philosophy majors become lawyers. One of my first jobs in high school was working in a law library, and I decided then and there I would never become a lawyer, let me tell you. But some people like that. So there's a lot of other options: psychologists, counselors, life coach. There's a whole life coach thing. Well, what does that mean? You help people navigate life. Philosophy seems like good training for that. Doctors, there's a lot of ethical situations in medicine, but doctors, nurses, there's things like palliative care where you're helping people who are dying, trying to get perspective on life before they leave this earthly plane. That's kind of hard. Writing and editing, I've done my share of that. Interior designer, I know someone who did philosophy and art history, and she does interior design and sort of helps people create the world that they live in, which is kind of neat. Architects, they're creating worlds too. Corporate trainers, so I know people who I've done training, and people who do training, they're good teachers, right? HR, you're trying to help people in HR. Financial planning, like I said, I know someone who does that. Business strategy, basically, how does the world work? How do we, as our organization, as a nonprofit or for-profit organization, how do we navigate that? Entrepreneurs, and so on. So let me just mention Reid Hoffman, who is a very wealthy investor and entrepreneur. His approach for both building companies, starting companies, and investing is they have to have a philosophy. So LinkedIn, for instance, has a philosophy about how people interact. The systems that were there before were very corporate-oriented. His system was very focused on the individual. The individual is the center of the world in LinkedIn, and then you connect all these other individuals. There's kind of a philosophy behind that, and he looks for that kind of thing when he invests in companies. In my own field, in technology, I know a lot of philosophy majors, in fact, who do very well in technology. They didn't necessarily learn this stuff in college. Some of them are programmers. Quality assurance, somehow there's a lot of people in QA who studied philosophy, and I've been thinking about this, trying to figure it out, and I think they're coherentists. So the whole idea with QA is the whole system's got to work together. And if you have things that don't cohere, that's a problem, that's a bug. And you would try to identify that. So QA people, there's a lot of people who do QA who've done philosophy. Software architects, I've done a lot of software architecture. You basically design how a whole system works. You need a lot of systematic sort of thinking to make that happen. Managers, executives, actually there's a woman that in my organization who just got promoted. She's now a director. So we have sort of individual contributors, we call them. And then we have managers, and then we have senior managers, and then we have directors. So she's a director, and she's a director of our data science team. Data science is sort of a new field that's come about where you're synthesizing a lot of information. You need to know statistics. You also helps to have domain knowledge, and also tends to involve some programming and machine learning and things like that. That's a hot new field. Very hot new field, in fact, and I know several people who did philosophy who are data scientists. User researchers. So user research is really cool. It's kind of like applied anthropology. So you go out and study how people actually use computer systems and how they interact with them. And so and then you do these field studies. It's kind of a cool thing. I know several people who did philosophy who are user researchers. Privacy specialists. As I said, privacy is a huge deal right now. And being able to understand what rights do you really have to the data that you are throwing off every minute through your mobile apps and things like that. Who really should be able to access that data? Who shouldn't? There are a lot of ethical issues involved. A policy analyst. This is kind of like applied political philosophy. I do some work with our policy team trying to influence legislation, influence regulations that happen both here and in Europe and other parts of the world. There's a lot of philosophical aspects to this. And so on. Some of these job titles didn't even exist 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. The nice thing about philosophy is it gives you a lot of flexibility. So my conclusion is philosophy and practical skills. You can't if you just have the practical skills, as you get farther in your career, you're not necessarily going to have those insights that philosophy majors have, but you got to have some practical skills, which took me years to learn. I kind of wish I double majored in something other than ancient Greek. So that's sort of now we get to the philosophical part of the talk here. This is the kind of question that Socrates, well, what is success, right? And he would have quizzed someone and they would have been left fumbling for words at the end of the dialogue, and then Plato would have ended the whole thing and no one would really know what success is. So I'm going to provide the answer. Because, so we talked about career success, which is important, but it's one limited aspect of life. And I think there are a lot more interesting and important reasons to study philosophy than making a lot of money. It's cool, right? It's a fascinating, kind of beautiful, challenging realm of inquiry that is endless. And so there's a lot of hard problems there, and it's some fun to think about. It's intrinsically rewarding, I think, to try to figure these things out. And I study this stuff on my free time, and I'm reading the complete works of Aristotle right now. It's cool. And you can do it forever because no one has the answers, and we're always still puzzling over what is the meaning of life and things like that. So it's kind of fun to just think about. I think it kind of makes life worth living to puzzle over these things. As human beings, that's what we're here for, to try to figure things out. The other thing I think is that you look at the history of philosophy, there's a lot of great ideas and values and practices that you can apply to your own life. Things like self-knowledge, mindfulness, self-control, responsibility, moderation, patience, because we're sort of delaying gratification, right? That's sort of a philosophical thing. Courage, standing up for the right thing, justice, truthfulness, fairness, respecting others. Nonviolence is a big thing in many philosophies, and so on. And these are really consistent ideas. I mean, you can read the Stoics, you can read Buddhism, you can read Aristotle and Thoreau and Montaigne and people like that. They all talk about these things. They turn up again and again, and these are things that you can apply in life. And they're useful at work. I find them very useful at work, to respect other people, to do the right thing. You have to manage yourself. A lot of the world and a lot of working in organizations is actually managing yourself. Even if you're managing others, you got to manage yourself first. And that's sort of the hardest part, and philosophy gives you a lot of insights in how to manage yourself. There's collaborating. So how do you work with other people? How do you respect other people, respect their viewpoints, listen to them, really hear what their views are? Perspective, kind of dealing with loss. I've gotten fired a few times, and it's not a lot of fun. But if you have sort of a philosophical attitude about it, well, I can deal with that. I can overcome that. And there's a lot of perspective. So organizations are pretty screwed up. And if you don't have some perspective on that and kind of understand at some level why that is and try to really puzzle it through, you can get pretty disappointed and pretty discouraged. Here's my Kant quote for Garrett here. From the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing has ever been made. Right? There's none of these organizations are perfect. In fact, most of them are pretty messed up. Try to figure that out and have some perspective on it. I find these qualities are also helpful in your personal relationships and working in communities. I've done volunteering and stuff like that. It's good to have some perspective on these things. And the third thing is, I think philosophy, to me, is a way of life. If you read Pierre Hadot, he has some nice books about this. What is ancient philosophy? Philosophy is a way of life, and so on. He talks about this. And it can make you a good person, and I think it's important to be a good person. Character integrity, I think, are keys. You get known in an organization or in your industry for how you deal with people. And if you're a jerk, the word gets around. And if you deal with people with integrity and respect, that gets around too, and people recognize that. Now, it can take a while, because the jerks can seem to be getting ahead, but eventually it sort of comes around, in my view. That's what I've seen in my experience. Now, of course, not everyone who studies philosophy becomes a wise person or a good person. I've got examples, even some famous philosophers. You can ask me about this in the question and answer period. They've done some pretty bad stuff, even famous philosophers, Rousseau and so on. But I think it's worth striving to be the best person you can. And I think philosophy can make you an accomplished person, not just an accomplished career person, but an accomplished person. Spinoza, I've never really been able to understand Spinoza, But I had a professor at Columbia, by the way. He says, you just need to put on your Spinozistic glasses, right? And then you can understand. He didn't have a German accent. I can't remember who that was. But it sounds better with the faux German accent. But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. It's hard to become an accomplished person. It's hard to become a good person. But it's worth pursuing. So my advice is don't be average, be exceptional. So thanks. Any questions, or you want to argue?